All right, guys. 4.4, Unit 4, Section 4, Scavenger Hunt. It's over Chapter 6, Section 3 of the book. I hope that's not confusing. The Radical Days of the Revolution. So it begins on page 223 of the textbook. That's actually old news. It begins on page 585. There are different editions of the text, so I apologize for that. But I want you guys to answer these questions and then create a timeline of the events, because there are a lot of dates in this section, and it's worth talking about when some of this stuff happens. Basically, these questions more or less happen in order, so we'll deal with them as they go. Question number 1 says, what happened on August 10th, 1792, after tensions led to violence? We read on page 585 how I should probably open this so I can be all together on this. Yeah, so French troops had declared war on the neighboring countries, and they were really getting beat down on pretty bad. So they were losing a lot of battles, and people sort of blamed the king for what had happened. They said that he was a traitor, that the battles were somehow his responsibility, or I should say these losses were somehow his responsibility. And the textbook says that tensions led to violence. On August 10th, 1792, a crowd of Parisians, that is people from Paris, stormed the royal palace of the Tuileries and slaughtered the king's guards. So, yeah, a crowd broke into the palace, I almost said castle, and slaughtered the king's guards. Okay. They stormed the palace and killed the guards. It's worth noting here, the royal family fled. They ran away. They had to run away. They actually went to the building where they did the Estates General. The royal family, actually that's not true. Not the same building, but they went to the Legislative Assembly, which was a nearby building. What happened a month later? A month later, citizens attacked prisons that held nobles and priests accused of political offenses. About 1,200 prisoners were killed. Among them were many ordinary criminals. Historians disagree about the people who carried out the September massacres. Some call them bloodthirsty mobs. Others describe them as patriots defending France from its enemies. Okay. Most of the people killed were not necessarily traitors to France. But we need to say what happened was the September massacres. And in these September massacres, 1,200 people in prisoners killed. Something in the chat.
Gabe said he can't find his shirt.
All right, Gabe. These were people accused of political crimes. The next question is, when was King Louis XVI beheaded? I mean, we can see here, this thing went off the rails quickly, right? They went from having a society broken into 3 social classes that each had different levels of privilege and responsibility, to now they're killing the king. Backed by crowds in Paris, radicals took control of the National Assembly. Radicals called for the election of a new legislative body. They wanted the right to vote to be extended to all male citizens. And things got way more radical. And they established a republic. During the early months of this republic, they put Louis XVI on trial as a traitor to France. The king was convicted by a single vote. That means one less vote, he wouldn't have been convicted. And he was sentenced to death. In January 1793, he mounted a scaffold in the public square in the Place de la Concorde in Paris. He started to speak, but a roll of drums drowned out his words. Moments later, he was beheaded, and the executioner lifted his head by the hair and held it in front of the crowd. This happened in January 1793. The revolution had been going on for a while at this point, but here we see this radical phase. We went from people arguing politics in stuffy rooms and tennis courts to they're cutting off people's heads. And here we go. Marie Antoinette followed in October of the same year. The popular press of France celebrated her death, but she did show dignity as she went to the scaffold. Okay. Question number 5 asks us to compare viewpoints. Okay. Or actually, we're not going to compare them as much as we're going to look at how the London Times looked at this. So we said that the popular press in France celebrated the death of the Queen and presumably the King. We want to look, how did the London Times, London being in England, right? This is a neighboring kingdom. The London Times, how did they report on the King's execution? And they said, I'll read you the whole thing, but then we'll write down. So, London Times, January 25th, 1793. The Republican tyrants of France have now carried their bloody purposes to the uttermost diabolical stretch of savage cruelty. They have murdered their king without even the shadow of justice. And of course, they cannot expect friendship or intercourse with any civilized part of the world. The vengeance of Europe will now rapidly fall on them, and in the process of time, make them the veriest wretches on the face of the earth. The name of Frenchman will be considered as the appellation of savage, and their presence shunned as a poison, deadly destructive to the peace and happiness of mankind. It appears evident that the majority of the National Convention and the executive government of that truly despotic country are comprised of the most execrable villains upon the face of the earth. So, they weren't happy about the death of the king. But we can quote the text as evidence here and say that the London Times said that they have murdered their king without even a shadow of justice. We see here where we can justify how other kingdoms disagreed with what France was doing. We can justify this with a direct quote. Okay? This is the same thing we're being asked to do in English class when we're writing our essays. We need to make the point that England wasn't happy about it, and here's a quote to show us some evidence of that. Question number 6 asks, what did Robespierre do with the Committee of Public Safety? This was a tricky question. I had trouble getting the wording right on this question. But what did he do with the Committee of Public Safety? Well, for one, he was the leader of it. And he also orchestrated, he began the Reign of Terror. Okay. The Reign of Terror was a period in French history, okay, that we're going to learn about here, but I'll do it really quickly. I want to point out that the Reign of Terror, this is not the same thing as the Great Fear. The Great Fear was a different thing in French history. The Great Fear happened earlier when people were sort of panicked and they were still arguing about stuff in stuffy rooms. The Great Fear happened in the countryside where peasants, farm workers, were going into the homes of these nobles and burning records and stealing grain and threatening these nobles. Where the Reign of Terror was in the cities where they were dragging people out of their homes and chopping their heads off. And or hanging them or imprisoning them forever until they rotted in prison. So different event. Okay. All right. I'm going to clear the notes here and I'm going to move on. Catch them in the video later if you need them. Question 7 says, when did the Reign of Terror begin and end? When did it begin and end? Let's see. The guillotine defines the Reign of Terror. Robespierre was one of the chief architects of the Reign of Terror, which lasted from September of 1793 to July of 1794. So nearly a year, it was just constant fear and terror and murder. Anyone accused of going against the French Revolution, especially if people had some wealth, they were in fear of being dragged out of their homes and killed by the crowds, by the mobs of Paris. There was a lot of political dissent. There were different political groups called the Jacobins. There was Le Montagne. There were all these weird sort of political parties, and they each were sort of fighting for control and fighting for power over this radical phase of the French Revolution. And in that struggle, a lot of them were accusing each other of being traitors, and a lot of them were being killed. You have to understand that during this time, a lot of the people who were accused of being traitors might not have any credible reason to be accused. When things get really bloody like this, a lot of what happens in history, we find, is that a lot of innocent people are falsely accused because it serves some other purpose. If Mr. Wayne has a car that I really, really like, okay, I might go to the authorities and say, Mr. Wayne is a traitor to La République, and he's trying to stop the French Revolution. You should get him. And as soon as they chop his head off, I'm going to take his car. Okay? There was a lot of that sort of thing going on. There was a lot of fake accusations and awful. Give me a really weird look. I don't like your car, right?
It's just a Honda Civic, man.
I'm a truck guy. But the point stands, a lot of the time, these accusations just flew, all right? And there were a lot of regular beefs that were lumped in with this Reign of Terror. And that's what happened. And people were genuinely afraid. It became like, well, I better accuse Mr. Wayne before Mr. Wayne accuses me. Because the first one to get their accusation in, they've got a better chance, seemingly. All right. Who was killed during the Reign of Terror? Suspect were those who resisted the revolution. About 300,000 people were arrested during the Reign of Terror. 17,000 were executed. 17,000 executed. That's a lot of people. Populations in cities at this time were nowhere near what they are now. Many of these people were victims of mistaken identity or were falsely accused by their neighbors. Many more, so 17,000 were the ones killed, but many more of them were packed into hideous prisons where deaths from disease were quite common. The engine of the terror was the guillotine. Okay, it's this fancy head choppy off device. I'm going to ask you to define that in the test, and you can say that if you want. because it's funny. But really, it was a very fancy contraption that was essentially an axe. It was a machine made for dropping a very heavy blade on the back of someone's neck. Yeah. So who was killed? 17,000 accused of going against the revolution. The next question, were all of the people guilty? Well, I've gone on and on about this, but it's worth saying this out loud. No. No, many of these people were bystanders. Some of these people just happened to be the wrong place at the wrong time. Some were trying to help the revolution, but they weren't doing it in the way that the leaders of this revolution wanted. Okay? Some of them were women who were fighting for women's rights amongst all of this madness, and the women were killed for their trouble. Some of them were people who just lived in the royal palace. Remember earlier on we said it was like the first question, what happened on August 10th, 1792? Well, when the crowd stormed that palace, one of the things they did, they dragged some of the queen's friends, her best buddy, her best girlfriend, out of the building, and she was killed. And although that didn't necessarily happen during the Reign of Terror, there were other people that were friendly to the king that were killed during this time. So were all of the people who were killed guilty? No. Many, if not most, were falsely accused of going against the revolution. And there's a big, big story there. There's some that were actually quite famous, but we're not going to cover every single little detail because that gets way long. Question 10 asks us to draw a diagram of a guillotine. Now listen, I am no artist, but if you look at page 588 of the textbook, you can see a device that has a blade shaped like this. Okay. It has kind of a gantry up here that holds it up. Look at my awesome smartboard art. Okay. And then there's a little hole here for sticking people's heads in. And like a little table to lay them in. This is a guillotine. This blade falls down. It was thought that this was a less cruel way of killing people. It was thought that it was more instant and less violent somehow. All right, I'm going to clear these notes. You know, I just made this beautiful drawing and move down to question number 11. Question number 11 asks us, what happened to Robespierre? Well, we can guess that if Robespierre is the architect or one of the main architects, if he led the Committee of Public Safety to do this reign of terror and cut off these people's heads, and we know that this reign of terror often accused innocent people, then we just know that at some point people are going to get tired of it and they're going to have some pushback on it, right? The textbook says, within a year, the terror consumed those who initiated it, the people that started it. Tired of the bloodshed and fearing for their own lives, the members of the convention turned on the Committee of Public Safety. On the night of July 27th, 1794, Robespierre was arrested. The next day, he was executed. After the heads of Robespierre and other radicals like him fell, after they were executed, the executions slowed down dramatically. They nearly ended. Remember, we said earlier that the Reign of Terror ended in July of 1794, so it was this same month that it ended. There's kind of an interesting story about Robespierre's execution. The night he was arrested, he apparently, although it's not certain exactly what happened, he apparently tried to shoot himself in the face. And so when they dragged him to the guillotine for his execution, he had a huge wound in his jaw where he had kind of missed. He had shot himself, or he was shot, or something. But he was pretty far gone by the time they executed him anyway. So, executed in July of that year, which was 94. The next question asks us, what set up the directory? So we remember back in the earlier lecture, we said that the French Revolution was made up of about 4 stages. Here we see the end of the second stage. We see the end of the radical phase, I guess we called it phase, the radical phase of the revolution. And it's with this, with the directory. In reaction to the reign of terror, the revolution entered a 3rd stage. Moving away from the excesses of the convention, that is the craziness of the convention, moderates produced another constitution for France. This is one that we're not going to memorize, okay? But there was another constitution for France called the Constitution of 1795. It set up the 5-man directory, okay? I'm not going to ask you what was the Constitution of 1795, because there's a Constitution of 1791 and there were earlier ones in the text. We're not going to just memorize all of the different constitutions that France tried to write as it pressed on, right? There's 1791, 1795. There were a number, I think, in 97. There was a whole thing, but they set up a 5-man directory, and this 5-man directory had the responsibility of governing France in a more calm way. And so it set up the directory in a legislature elected by male citizens of property. Okay. The middle class and professional people of the bourgeoisie were the dominant force during this stage of the French Revolution. The bourgeoisie are in charge of France now. Remember, these are the wealthiest members of the Third Estate. These are the people that France owed the money to in the beginning. France had all these money problems. Well, who were the bankers? It was this bourgeoisie. So now they're in charge of France. They held power from 1795 to 1799. They were weak, but they were dictatorial. Okay? The directory faced growing discontent. This means that they called the shots. They didn't really do a whole lot of debate with the people once they got in power. Okay, they just kind of decided what was going to be, and that's what was. They made the rules. They made peace with Prussia and Spain, but the war with Austria and Great Britain did continue. Corrupt leaders of the directory lined their own pockets, but failed to solve France's problems. When rising bread prices stirred hungry sans-culottes to riot, the directory quickly suppressed it. They suppressed it. They put them down with force.
They were rioting over bread because the rich were just laying, loafing around.
I don't know if you've heard Mr. Wayne, but he said that the sans-culottes were rioting over bread because they thought the bourgeoisie were just loafing around. I can't account for this guy. I don't know. That's a terrible joke. Okay. So at this point, we see Napoleon Bonaparte come to power. How? As chaos threatened, politicians turned to Napoleon Bonaparte, a popular military hero who had won a series of brilliant victories against the Austrians in Italy. He did a lot of other stuff too. The politicians planned to use Napoleon to advance their own goals. So how did he come to power? Politicians were going to use him. For their own goals. Sorry about my handwriting, guys. I really probably should have typed this one out for us. To their dismay, however, before long, Napoleon would outwit them all and become ruler of France. So France goes from a king to a constitutional monarchy to, well, people are unhappy with the constitutional monarchy, the sans-culottes take over and they say, no, this is a republic, to the republic is still sort of out of hand and things get crazy and they have the reign of terror, to Napoleon. So they go from a king to freedom, to violence, to a dictator. That is the story of the French Revolution in a nutshell. We're going to look at question number 15 here before we get into this timeline. And Mr. Wayne with more goofy jokes. I'm going to clear these notes and move on. Oh, this guy.
I was trying to get it in before you.
Yeah. So, question number 15 said, how do people shift from loyalty to the king to nationalism in France? And here, at the end of the French Revolution, we see one of the birthplaces of nationalism. And nationalism is one of the things we'll talk about quite a bit in our modern world history class. And here we see it defined. So first of all, what is nationalism? It's a strong feeling of pride and devotion to one's country. Okay. We'll write that down in just a second. But we need to know, how do people shift from a loyalty to the king to nationalism in France? Revolution and war gave the French people a strong sense of national identity. In earlier times, people's loyalty went to their local authorities. So when you ask somebody, where are you from? They would say, well, I'm from Navarre, or I'm from Alsace, I'm from Paris, I'm from Lyon, one of these towns in France. Where are you from? They would tell you the town that they came from.
I'm from Ohio.
Later, as King Louis XIV gobbled up power and became an absolute king in the country, people began to shift their loyalty to the king, the kingdom of France. And now when you would ask someone, what are you? They would say, I'm a Frenchman, you know, je suis français, right? They would say, I'm a Frenchman, I'm from France. With all of this turmoil and with the revolution, people started to shift their loyalty again. Well, I mean, once the king has his head cut off, you're not going to say, you know, I'm a member of this guy's kingdom, right? They would say, well, I'm French. I'm French, and my loyalty goes to France and my country, and people like me who speak like me and look like me, okay? So, we're going to go ahead and jot this down. In the past, people felt loyalty to local authorities. I'm going to type this one out, even though it's handwritten. I'm going to type this one. In the past, people had felt loyalty to local authorities. Then to the King of France. But in the revolution, loyalty was for France itself. Okay? And the idea of having national borders and a national language and a national culture, it comes from this time. So instead of being, loyal to my town or to my king, now I'm loyal to my area on the map. Okay. The whole idea of border walls and things like this, it comes from nationalism, this idea that we owe our loyalty and our sense of pride to a place. As Americans, when we pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, we're not pledging allegiance to a king. We're not pledging allegiance to our town. We're pledging allegiance to a nation of people. And the idea of a nation was born right around this time, perhaps right here in France. Okay. It's a strong feeling of pride and devotion to one's country. We're going to see how that gets out of control sometimes, but not now. We're going to do that when we talk about World War I and World War II. Okay. The next assignment I gave you guys was to go through and to build this. I'm creating these notes so I can just scroll. Go through and build this timeline. This timeline is the same thing that's in these notes, but they're put in order of when they happened. And you can see my example here. Question number 1 talks about the storming of the royal palace, okay, where the guards were killed. Part number 2 I filled in for you. It talks about the September massacres, okay, they targeted priests and nobles that were accused of political offenses. Actually, I think the notes we used here were 1,200. 1,200 were killed. That was kind of the number we used there. Number 3 would be January 1793. King Louis the 14th. Sorry, King Louis the 16th. Wow, I just can't. XVI. Executed.
You say 14th or 16th?
So King Louis the 14th was his grandfather. He set up absolutism in France. We didn't really talk about him except for we keep going back to saying he got all this started. King Louis the 16th is the one that got his head cut off.
Sorry, that might be my misunderstanding. I could have swore you said 14th, and I wanted to double check.
Yeah. King Louis the 16th is the one that lost the French Revolution. King Louis the 14th, his grandfather, was one of the people who helped cause it. Marie Antoinette was beheaded. This next event, this is October. And we can go on and on. We can see the next event was Robespierre was killed. Or actually, that would be the next event. The next event would be the Reign of Terror begins. And the date for that would be September 1793. And then later on, there's going to be some events, and we're going to see July 1794. I'm not going to fill out this whole timeline, but I think that the best way to organize these events in your notes would be for you guys to go through these questions and one at a time, put them on this timeline. And I'm not going to go over every one of them, but I think you guys see my example. Okay? That's it for the radical days of the revolution. And we will now move into talking about the directory. Talk about the directory and the age of Napoleon. Those sections are much shorter. I'm less fascinated with them, so we sort of hustle through them. But that's it for the getting into the bloody parts of the French Revolution.